Welcome to ISR's 75th Anniversary Symposium. For those of you whom I haven't met yet, my name is Mike Traugott. I'm a professor emeritus in the Center for Political Studies and co-chair of this event. In a moment, you'll meet my colleague and co-chair Grace Noppert from the Survey Research Center. We want to acknowledge the members of our ISR community in attendance, faculty, staff, and students, as well as our extended family of alumni and collaborators, both here and abroad, and our special guests who are visiting as part of the Catalyst Week we're holding in conjunction with the symposium. Organizing the symposium was the idea of Kate Cagney, the director of ISR, who also brought Grace and me together as the co-chairs for this event. We had a wonderful planning committee with representation from all of our centers and assistance from a great staff. We want to thank in advance all of the speakers and discussants and moderators who've taken time from their busy schedules to join us in this event. The program for the symposium was organized to recognize the history of the Institute and its research programs, some of the major work that's currently underway, and the contributions of ISR to the development of many social science fields. Given the range of the work done in ISR and the limited time for the symposium, the planning committee had to be selective in organizing this program. But I want to point out that later this afternoon at the reception in the Union Ballroom, we will showcase a lot of different programs currently functioning in ISR. They will have staff present to describe the work they do and to answer any questions that you might have. It takes a village to conduct research in the public interest the way we do in ISR. That means that there's an entire staff infrastructure devoted to preparing and submitting proposals, interviewing respondents, managing funded projects, and reporting to sponsors. All are important functions beyond the gestation of new ideas for projects from the research staff that could turn into a successful proposal. I have been fortunate to spend my entire career at ISR. Next June, it'll be 60 years since I arrived in Ann Arbor, right after graduating from college to become a graduate student in political science. I've had occasional opportunities to leave, but I never found a set of circumstances that improved upon my situation at ISR. In 1988, I spent a year at Gallup working on the election polls, and I had a chance to stay on there. I had an important conversation with Harold Jacobson, who was then the director of CPS, who suggested that I would have a great time at Gallup during election years, but in the interim, I would probably have to do some client work. If I stayed at CPS and ISR, I could be organizing my own research program, subject to available funding, of course, and pursuing work that really interested me, and I would benefit from the interactions with a great set of colleagues. Everything that Jake told me turned out to be true. Now I would like to introduce Grace Noppert from the Survey Research Center.
Good morning. It's so nice to see you guys here. Mike and I have been planning this for the last 12 months, so it's fun that it's finally here. I also want to start out with a few thank yous of my own. First to Kate for having the vision for this day and for putting this committee together. It's been so fun over the last 12 months to work on this. And it's been a real honor to hear her vision for ISR and to get to see how the 75th plays into that. I also want to thank you to Mike It's truly been such a pleasure to work alongside you this last year. You know, I'm not sure that Mike and I would have ever crossed paths had it not been for the ISR 75th, and I'm so grateful that we did. I have really loved learning from Mike and hearing the stories about ISR throughout the years. And for those of you that don't know, Mike brings an extraordinary amount of humor to all of these occasions, and that has been so fun and lightened the load over the last year. So, you know, I'm really lucky to be able to call you friend now. So as we gather today, I want to talk about a few acknowledgments first. First, I want to recognize that this is Indigenous Peoples Day. In honor of this, we are highlighting events that are occurring throughout the year that are led by Indigenous groups here on campus and honor the rich traditions of the diverse Indigenous communities that are a part of our larger Michigan community. So if you check out the screens throughout the atrium, there will be a running slideshow with QR codes related to all of those events, and we encourage you to check those out. They're not just limited to today. We also, as Mike mentioned, as part of the 75th, we hosted two major initiatives, the ISR Showcase and Catalyst Week. The showcase is happening this evening in the Union, and it's a way to highlight the wide scope of scholarship and rich activities that we as ISR engage in. We're also so excited about all the projects that are participating in this, and thank you for all your work getting ready for the showcase. Mike also mentioned the Catalyst Week initiative. So this was to increase our international collaborations and really build long-term relationships with different partners throughout the world. And we're pleased to welcome two groups, and I hope that if you get to meet them that you'll give them the warm ISR welcome. The first is a group from the University of Cape Town, the Southern Africa Labor and Development Research Unit, and they are designing and implementing a new national panel study of aging across South Africa. So we're so excited that you guys are here. We would also like to extend a warm welcome to a group from the Ministry of Itoke Affairs in Fiji. This group is working on developing and analyzing new data from a village household census. This study is the first robust data set out of any Pacific Island nation with measures on demographic, social, cultural, economic, health, food security, housing, and environment, and we are so excited to learn more about this important work and find ways to collaborate. So if you see these two groups, please make sure to introduce yourself and welcome them to ISR. While we're also in the celebrating mood, I want to highlight another upcoming anniversary, and that is for Monitoring the Future. They are celebrating 50 years this upcoming year, and they're hosting a celebration on February 27th here at ISR, and information can also be found on the screens throughout the atrium. A few other housekeeping things. There's a slight change in the schedule, and there's going to be a little bit of flex throughout the day, so just look for posted signs or grab one of us. The party's politic and polarization session will now begin at 10:25 and 14:30. This is to allow a few minutes for coffee, which I'm sure everyone is grateful for. Lunch is going to go from 12:30 to 1:45 in the Union. There's also a QR code on the screens here with a map, but I also suggest you just grab an ISR and have them walk you over to the Union. It's just a few blocks over this way. There are restrooms here and over here in the middle. And then there's elevators if you need to go to the 6th floor for a session, both at right back here and also in the middle. That'll take you to the 6th floor. Okay, as we wrap up this introductory session, I want to just say a few words to kind of set the stage for today. So I joined the faculty in 2020, right at the beginning of the pandemic. And despite the world being shut down and very isolated, I found ISR to be extraordinarily warm and welcoming, eager to kind of bring me into the ISR fold. And while I'm relatively new to ISR as a faculty member, I've been admiring the work that's being done here for many, many years. And actually, I remember, like it was yesterday, the first time I walked through those doors. I had the good fortune of going to graduate school here over the School of Public Health, and one of my advisors was a social epidemiologist, still is a social epidemiologist here, and I had come over here to meet with her. And as soon as I walked through those doors, I felt like something was different here. I didn't know what it was then, but I think I do now. There's something a little bit magical about ISR that you only get when you're here. My work, my scholarship, is extremely interdisciplinary, and it brings together biology and infectious disease and epidemiology and sociology. And as I've been building my career, I've often found that I don't fit within typical academic boundaries. But here at ISR, I have found my home. Here, my big, risky, scientific ideas are not only tolerated, but they're welcomed. They're even encouraged. In fact, no one here scoffs at the enormity of my ideas. Rather, they ask how they can come alongside me. As we've been preparing for the 75th over the last year, I've learned a bit more about how we came to be. And I think about our founders and who they were. And they perhaps didn't fit into neat traditional academic boundaries either. They had groundbreaking ideas, and they created a space to take those on. And I think at their core, they were dreamers. And the vestiges of those dreams remain in all of us at ISR today. ISR is a bustling place, and I know that hustle and bustle well. We all do. But I encourage you to allow yourself the time and space over the next day and a half to really set that hustle and bustle aside for a moment and just be together. Take the time to be with our community, to not only reflect on our rich history, but to chart a course for the future, to think about the big social issues that are facing us today and how we at ISR are tackling them. Bring us your boldest, your brightest, your messiest ideas because they have a home here. Here, they're achievable because ISR has always and will always be for the dreamers. We're so grateful that you're here today, and we're excited to celebrate with you and look forward to connecting with you all throughout the next day and a half. Thank you.
And now we're going to begin with our program. Our first speaker is Robert Groves. Bob Groves came to Ann Arbor in 1970 as a graduate student in sociology, receiving his PhD in 1975. He started his career as an assistant study director in the Survey Research Center, working his way up to become the director of SRC in 2001. From 2009 to 2012, Bob was the director of the U.S. Bureau of the Census, after which he was appointed as the provost at Georgetown University. Describing himself as a social statistician and survey methodologist, he's authored or co-authored 7 books and scores of peer-reviewed articles. His 1989 book, Survey Errors and Survey Costs, was named one of the 50 most influential books in survey research by the American Association for Public Opinion Research. His book, Non-Response in Household Interview Surveys with Mick Cooper, received the 2008 APOR Book Award. And his co-authored book, Survey Non-Response, received the 2011 APOR Book Award. We're pleased that Bob can be with us today for the symposium. Since June, he has been filling in as the interim president of Georgetown University, while John DeGioia is recuperating from a stroke. Welcome back, Bob.
Someone must be controlling this. Okay, great. It's great to be here. Great to see old friends who are a little older. So when I started writing these remarks, I must admit my memories went out of control, and I started remembering all sorts of crazy things that were done in this building, most of which I participated in. And so I thought it appropriate, given my position in this wonderful symposium, to reminisce a bit. And so I'm going to retell the origin story. It's on the wall, but I'm going to do it in a way, hopefully, that has a set of anecdotes for some of the founders who ended up being mentors of me. So I had the privilege of knowing those who started this institute, and I thought it appropriate to just reminisce a bit. And so I will. And one way to think about what I'm going to say is that I have great affection, admiration for the wisdom and the far-sightedness of a set of people who both became wonderful scholars in their fields, but didn't just do that. They built an organization that thousands of people then followed and built to become even better. In 1932, Henry Wallace, this man whose picture you see, was 46 years old. He was appointed by the first-term President Franklin Roosevelt as Secretary of Agriculture. He was an agronomist. He was a protege of George Washington Carver, who studied agronomy at Iowa State University. Wallace's father taught there. And as a young boy, he sort of followed Carver from field to field. Carver, as you may recall, was quite interested in the nature of seed generation. Wallace used that to build his career. He began experimenting with hybridization as a young boy. He founded the Pioneer Seed Company, which was a hybrid seed company, became quite wealthy. He has a paper with George Snedeker at Iowa State, one of the famous statisticians, on linear regression and regression methods. So he was an extraordinary appointment as a Secretary of Agriculture. Upon confirmation, he became the dynamo of the New Deal. More legislation was passed early from the Department of Agriculture than any other cabinet department. He assembled around him a brain trust of young minds. At one time, Nelson Rockefeller and Adlai Stevenson shared an office in the Department of Agriculture as young aides. So he was a magnet of talent. In that same year, Rensis Lickert finished his PhD dissertation. He was a Michigan undergraduate, class of 26. He was 29 years old when he finished his PhD dissertation at Columbia with the findings about the performance of the 5-point scale, what we now call the Likert scale, or some people who don't know Rensis Lickert, the Likert scale. By the way, Betsy Lickert David was in a research methods class at Ohio State when the professor said, "Today we're going to talk about the Likert scale," and she raised her hand. I think it's pronounced Lickert, and he said, "My dear, I know what I'm saying. It is the Likert scale." And she said, "Well, I think I'm his son, or his daughter," and so on. In 1939, after being an NYU assistant professor in psychology, Lickert was recruited by Wallace as a director of a unit called Program Surveys. The unit was Wallace's attempt to understand why agricultural subsidies offered by New Deal programs were experiencing such a low take-up. He needed information about the failure of a set of programs. It is difficult to imagine for us right now the motivation of these founders. I was in Powell Books in Portland, Oregon, decades ago, and ran across this odd volume, the 1940 Yearbook of Agriculture. In that book is a short article written by Rensis. This was written in 1939, I think. The title of the article is Democracy in Agriculture, Why and How. In fact, if you read the entire book, a government publication, you will be amazed at the political philosophy that is espoused chapter after chapter. This is not a dry government book that's giving merely facts about agriculture. And so his article begins by saying, you know, all these new federal programs are really designed to serve the people. But there's a danger here that the administrators of these programs, sitting in Washington, so far removed from the people they serve, will lose touch with the real needs of the people. And so the country, the democracy, at this moment needs a new way for the bureaucracy to keep in touch with the people. And the solution, you turn a page and you see a table that many of you have seen over and over again, standard errors as a function of sample size and percentage estimates. So when you turn the page, the solution to democracy is the sample survey. The book is filled with this sort of commentary. I also remind us that in 1940, George Gallup published a book called The Pulse of Democracy. So the early sample survey researchers had this deep belief that they were there to save democracy. And so there's a bunch of sample survey evangelism that you feel in watching the behavior of the founders of ISR and the survey research community outside of ISR. Let me go back to here. Rensis became the director of morale surveys for U.S. strategic bombing surveys. They did all their work on talking to farmers and interviewing farmers. He was awarded the Medal of Freedom, perhaps the only survey researcher who's been awarded the Medal of Freedom. In 1946, the unit, program surveys, was abolished, just wiped out in a budget cut. Rensis and his colleagues rented an office on Connecticut Avenue. I've found the building. It's a little Flatiron building on Connecticut. I think they rented one office, and they began a search for a university environment within one day's train ride of Washington, D.C. The University of Michigan offered a home, which is a separate story that's just fascinating. The people who internal to the university said, you know, these guys are a little crazy, but let them come. They may do some good work. With Rensis came several others, all of them connected to the Federal Civil Service. So it's worth remembering that the roots of ISR lies in public service. Foremost among them was Angus Campbell, who was exposed to Kurt Lewin and his work when he was a PhD student at Stanford. Lewin is considered by some to be one of the founders of the field of social psychology. In fact, if you look at the background of so many of the founders, social psychology looms large. It was a field that was emerging at the same time. Angus, after his PhD at Stanford, taught at Northwestern. And then in 1942, he was the recipient of the magnet of Rensis at Program Surveys and joined him in DC at the Department of Agriculture. But there were others. Bob Kahn joined from the field division of the Census Bureau after having been field manager for interviewers in the Detroit area, then moving to DC. Leslie Kish, I'm out of order here. Leslie Kish joined Rensis from the Census of Agriculture division at the Census Bureau. He turned out to be the sampling statistician for the Survey Research Center, but at the time, he actually admitted he knew nothing about sample surveys. This, you have to realize, was a time of great invention and discovery. Leslie repeatedly told the story of after work hours at the Department of Agriculture, a bunch of guys, I think, went to the conference room of the Secretary of Agriculture, and they taught each other the statistics underlying sample surveys in the Secretary's conference room. I can't imagine that happening now. You probably can't even get into that conference room. The very first probability-based measurement of national unemployment took place in 1940, and most of the major innovators were part of that study group in DC at the time. Both, let me go back to Bob Kahn. Both Bob and Leslie would later complete their PhDs at the University of Michigan. Bob in psychology, Leslie in sociology. Now, I worked for Leslie as a graduate student for some years. He was a unique mind and spirit. He was infinitely quirky and deeply lovable. All the graduate students at the time shared these little bitty desks in a big, we didn't have cubicles, little bitty desks, and we hung out in that room. There was a chalkboard. I remember one of the graduate students who stood in the doorway near the chalkboard and performed a perfect rendition of Leslie's unique classroom lecturing style. He was going on, we were laughing, almost falling off our chairs, and Leslie walks up behind this graduate student, unbeknownst to the graduate student who was going on, and we were all going, oh, stop. But to our friend doing the Kish impression, he was unaware. I have to tell you, the laughter subsided rather quickly, and we went on with our work. Charlie Cannell, Charlie to everyone, even a graduate student, as I recall, joined RINSIS already completing his PhD in clinical psychology. It's an important background of him. Those roots were seen throughout his research work on two-person interaction and survey interviewing. And of course, he and Bob Kahn wrote the book, The Dynamics of Interviewing, which actually established a field that lasts still. It became a classic, heavily influenced the field by that perspective. I worked closely with Charlie also over the years. One story that I remember relates to an important first responsibility I had at ISR soon after completing my PhD. Bob Kahn and Charlie wrote just a dynamite NSF proposal that suggested what the world needed at the time was a randomized experiment comparing national telephone surveys to area probability face-to-face surveys. It was awarded, and then both of them promptly went on sabbatical. So here I was, I don't know how old I was, but I was much too young to run that study. I ran the project, which, by the way, ended up being transformative for me. It really taught me a perspective about error structures of surveys that I hold today. When Bob returned, I had a manuscript of sorts all ready for him. I remember he sat down and he said, Bob, you know, this reads a little like a dissertation, which was the only thing I had ever written before. So Bob wrote key sections of that book. I would predict that if you looked at that book, you could discern which paragraphs he wrote and which paragraphs I wrote. One paragraph I'll never forget. It was prescient in many ways. It was a chapter on non-response, and he said, you know, it could be that the societal ingredients that permit sample surveys to perform well will not always be there. What are they? Well, they're the ability for a person sitting in their home to receive a request from a stranger and feel free and protected to tell them intimate details of their life. And if you think about how societies have changed since that time, you understand his thought. He was a beautiful writer and a lovely man, and I miss him still. Charlie, at the time, had a really cool funding stream that I don't believe exists in the world anymore. He had money from the National Center for Health Statistics. He would go there every year, and they would say, Charlie, what would you like to do this year? And he would say, well, I think the logical next step on what we're doing is this and this. How much money do you need, Charlie? I think I need about this. Great, see you next year. So in one of those meetings, I went along with him as a, little suitcase carrier. The chief of the section, in reaction to Charlie's pitch for new research, remarked that, in his opinion, this might be a good approach because he had happened to reread an article of some years earlier, and it made a case very similar to this. It formed a good rationale in his mind, which he described to us a little. And Charlie said, gee, I had to read that article. I'm not sure I have read that. And he asked, who wrote the piece? And the director said, well, you did, Charlie, a few years ago. So at the end of the war, by the way, the dates that I'm showing you are the dates that they joined at their colleagues in Ann Arbor and their age. So hopefully you're getting the sense that this was a young group of people filled with energy about a new thing. After World War II, there was a nationwide housing shortage, really severe. Ann Arbor was no different. In fact, in 1947, a few months after they arrived in Ann Arbor, the federal government sold Willow Run Airport to the university for $1. And I'm not sure this next part of what I'm saying is true, but I'd like it to be true. Several of the founders and their families had to live in housing at Willow Run. Now, my memory is that these were Quonset huts. So these are, for those of you who don't know what a Quonset hut is, they're metal semicircle structures, hot in the summer, cold in the winter. And so these Quonset huts were renovated. The renovations were hastily and poorly completed. My understanding is that each of them was divided into separate living units, but the walls between the units were just paper thin. Charlie and Martha Cannell, his wife, their bedroom was adjacent to the room where Carla Kish, a very young child, a baby at the time, Leslie and Rhea Kish's firstborn, was then a baby. And she often cried when they put her down to bed. So thin were the walls that Martha and Charlie would sing to her to calm her down and put her to sleep. Another founder was George Katona, who held a PhD in psychology from Germany. George had sent Rensis a paper that he had written on survey matters for Rensis's review. And Rensis, being Rensis, I now know, offered him a job at Program Surveys. So he joined Rensis. Katona is viewed by many as a key founder of what we now call behavioral economics. He became the program director of the Economic Behavior Program, something that still exists. George was a forceful intellect. If you saw him in seminars, you would be destroyed if you were the speaker. He created the consumer sentiment survey that still is in existence. Daniel Katz was a PhD in social psychology from Syracuse, one of the first PhDs in social psychology. He then taught at Princeton, and he conducted both experimental and survey work. He joined Program Surveys also in Washington in 1941, but then he quickly moved, when the war began, to the Office of War Information. But he joined the group in 1947, a little after the others. He led the organizational behavior program, and his book with Bob Kahn, The Social Psychology of Organizations, was a defining text. So I hope you're getting a flavor of the intellectual roots of programs that now exist, but were connected to one of the founders. They are the seeds of what we now know. But then there was a move. What these men established was the Survey Research Center. And there was a move connected to this man. Kurt Lewin, that figure important to Angus's life at Stanford, and a founder of social psychology, later moved from Stanford to form a center for research on group dynamics at MIT. He died in 1948. Before that occurred, a man named Dorwin Doc Cartwright left the group with Rensis to join Lewin at MIT. And in 1948, after Lewin's death, the center moved from MIT to Michigan, and that produced the Institute for Social Research with two different centers. That was formalized in 1949. We're using the 1949 date, I guess, for this anniversary. For many years, Rensis and Angus ran the center, then later the Institute. Rensis was the Institute director, Angus was the director of SRC. It's said in various writings that Rensis was the optimist of the pair. So if you had a good idea, first go to Rensis's office and sell the idea, and he would say, this is the best idea I've ever heard in my life. And then go to Angus and say, Rensis has approved this idea, and Angus would slow the idea down because he was the more sober, thoughtful, and careful judge of change and financial feasibility. Indeed, from Angus, as a young graduate student, I remember him saying that ISR was only 6 months away from bankruptcy, and I was worried, have I chosen the wrong, what have I done to my life? But then he added, with a little twinkle in his eye that was rarely there, but there at the moment, it's been that way for many years. I must admit, as a graduate student, I found Angus very intimidating. I remember coming into my little graduate student desk one day, and on a Monday, and there in the middle of the desk was a memo from Angus. Indeed, that memo was on every desk of the Institute, and it said that he had noticed that there were paper and files on top of cabinets in a very disorderly manner. And he directed their immediate removal and refiling. Only much later did I realize that he had that sobering side of him, but he also had a dry humor. As I said, I found him a pretty formal man. He often had a three-piece suit. In fact, a memory tattooed in my brain is Cindy and I, my wife, biking around Ann Arbor one day, passing by Angus's and Jean's house, and seeing him in the front yard pulling up a weed from his lawn, dressed in a three-piece suit. Now, that's probably an unfair observation. It was a Sunday, was probably back from church, noticed the weed, but it just fit my image of Angus. So later, ISR grew, and other units were added with similarly scholarly leadership. Warren Miller joined the Survey Research Center in 1951 with a master's degree. He completed a PhD at Syracuse in 54 and was an assistant professor at Berkeley. He returned to the University of Michigan and the then Survey Research Center as an assistant professor of political science and a research associate in the center. In 1962, he invented what was then called the Inter-University Consortium for Political Research, now called Political and Social Research. You don't have to think very long to realize what a fundamental building block ICPR, ICPSR, is for the democratization of social science data. First, for political science data. Warren was also a key leader in what we now call the national election studies, and I remind us in 1960, Campbell, Converse, Miller, and Stokes wrote The American Voter, which was a classic contribution to the understanding of civic participation. In fact, I once learned that Angus, when he visited small towns, if he had a few hours, would go to the public library to see if they had a copy of The American Voter. So important was the building of the reputation of the Institute. ICPR used a really quite novel, still novel, membership model for its logic, and gave governance rights to members. It was a brilliant invention of a consortium that spread the influence of ISR and the national election studies globally, really. Some years later, in 1970, a set of political scientists within the Survey Research Center joined him to create the Center for Political Studies, now a thriving center that's much more diverse than it was at its beginning. Ron Friedman, a sociologist and demographer in 1961, founded in the Department of Sociology the Population Studies Center. Ron was a survey researcher, a demographer that did fertility-related and family formation studies globally, especially in Taiwan. He was always seeking an understanding of decisions regarding family formation. He was a prolific scholar and a wonderful mentor. If you look at that picture carefully, you see a slight smile on Ron's face. And that attribute brought back vivid memories for me for a time when I thought my entire career was going down the drain. Ron was the chair of the Detroit Area Study, the advisory committee. I was the director of a year. The students would go to Detroit and do face-to-face interviewing. And at that year, I, a small, insignificant assistant professor, observed or was told that the students had gone on strike. They drove back from Detroit and they refused to do interviewing because of concerns about their safety, given a rough encounter in a neighborhood by two of the student interviewers. So Ron met with the striking students wearing that angelic, wise smile and listened to them quietly. Within a matter of hours, the students agreed to return to interviewing. We, as a quid pro quo, agreed to purchase, listen to this carefully, to purchase life insurance for the students for 50 cents a day for their days in Detroit. I never understood the logic of their agreement, since the payment of the life insurance required them to die, but I was forever grateful for Ron. He missed a career in labor negotiation, I think. After several moves, the Population Studies Center joined ISR in the late 90s. You may have noticed that the entire team that I've highlighted has no women. Have you noticed that? I must admit, in the initial wave in 1946, there were no women, but there were important women in the early days of the Survey Research Center. I want to mention three. Eva Mueller was a key leader in the economic behavior program, joining George Katona. I believe she was the first woman receiving a PhD in economics at Harvard. And I believe she told the following story. The chair of her dissertation committee, upon completion of the orals, asked her, by the way, Eva, what are you planning to do now that you have a PhD? And she noted that she didn't have a job yet. And he replied his face lit up. He replied, he loved her, he mentored her. He replied, it's so fortunate that the administrative assistant of the department had just left, and he was willing to put in a good word for her for that job. A measure of the time, and the measure of being a woman, a measure of being the first woman receiving a PhD in economics at Harvard. Irene Hess was the operation head of the sampling section in which I worked as a graduate student. She had worked as a statistician at the Census Bureau. She joined in '54. In 1946, at the end of the war, I'm told that she was laid off because there were so many returning soldiers who left their positions at the Census Bureau and fought in the war. She was saved by a famous statistician, Joe Waxberg, at the very last minute. Leslie Kish had performed sample design duties up to that point, but upon finishing his dissertation in '52, he began to do more research. Irene was a force of nature. She was almost totally humorless. She worked 60 hours a week every year of her life, I think. My favorite story is one that Steve Herringa told. She also made dynamite bourbon balls for holidays. The bourbon balls are so potent that when you opened up the metal lid, you were almost knocked back. Steve tells a story of Irene going to the liquor store that used to be on South U. I don't think it's there. And she was a petite woman walking out of this store with a big bottle of Jack Daniels walking down the street. Not Jack Daniels? Kentucky bourbon, sorry. She was a daughter of the state of Kentucky, Muhlenberg County, which happened to fall in the national sample as an area primary sampling unit. She trained me and hundreds of other graduate students in the practice of samples design. And Cindy, my wife, and I had the privilege of getting to know her as a person only after she retired and growing to love her in her last days here. Libby Devon, Elizabeth Devon, earned a PhD in psychology in 1951 here, and she remained in Ann Arbor her entire career. She was actually the first woman, I think, who was a member of the ISR faculty. She launched a program in family and sex roles that goes on still. She mentored hundreds of graduate students and later founded the Women's Studies program at Michigan. Over the decades, between 1940 and the 1970s, ISR became undoubtedly one of the most prominent collections of empirical social scientists. It was called, even when I was a graduate student, the Mecca that everyone had to visit at least once in their life if they were in the field. Its scientific output produced classic discoveries about how humans think and behave, how groups work together, and how groups fail to achieve their goals, how well-being, both financial and psychological, is distributed and transmitted across generations. But not every idea at ISR endured. I remember that at one point we had a publishing division. We printed our own books. It thrived for a long time. My hunch is, my hypothesis, but I don't know this to be true, is that in the early days, getting our work published was hard with traditional outlets. It was going against the grain, and it had a place at the time. It produced research study reports, but also full monographs. It was ended partly because the scientific impact of the research appeared to be better served by independent publishers promoting its work. And then the Center for Research on Utilization of Scientific Knowledge, or CRUSC, emerged in 1969, but then was terminated in 1985. I regret that, because if you just believe that the mission of the center was described by its title, we desperately need that right now. But funding for that center became tougher and tougher. The work fell out of favor for funding, and it was terminated. And of course, and one of the great strengths of ISR, in my belief, is that research programs emerge and are terminated over time. As human knowledge changes, it refreshes itself. So the scholars whose pictures you've seen built an organization that we all now enjoy, the world now enjoys, and we are in their debt. I think there are various reasons for this. ISR became quite distinctive among U.S. academic social science organizations in the late 90s. It was greatly more curiosity-driven than the National Opinion Research Center at Chicago, the Columbia Center, the Temple Institute for Survey Research. There was less contract research here done for companies or federal agencies. There was proportionally more peer-reviewed grant-based work. This also fed the need for a flat organization, as the curiosity of one leader rarely builds thriving organizations that are constantly evolving. The creative energy came from below with semi-autonomous research programs, imagining future work that was yet to be done. And the leadership had the primary goal of assuring an environment where the scientists did their best work. Indeed, the brilliance, in my opinion, of Lickert and Campbell is that they imagined key social science questions that needed answering in their initial assembly of the scientific team. Go back over the specialties of the founders. They were diverse. They were the seeds of the diversity of the intellectual product of ISR. Economic behavior, civic participation, effective functioning of human task-oriented groups, human well-being. As a provost, I also admire the culture that buffered the ongoing terror that one needs to raise one's salary every month. It's difficult to coast at ISR as a researcher. One lives by their wits. One is always thinking of the next step in a program of research, a thematically consistent and accumulating vein of discovery. The fact that one is surrounded by others from different fields, but sharing interests in the same area, is an important catalyst to novel ways of approaching research questions. A stimulus to self-critical thought is the fact that one must persuade one's peers in anonymous review panels with each new research proposal written. They must persuade their peers that the work will advance human understanding. Peer review takes place before the work is done, as well as when the product is disseminated. A brilliant feature of ISR, in my belief, was the acknowledgement that it needed to build an infrastructure to survey experimental and other observational measurements within the organization. In 1946, it built a national sample of areas, a national core of face-to-face interviewers who visited sample households to administer their interviews. Charlie Cannell introduced me to one of those first interviewers who was retired at the time in San Diego, and she told stories of visiting small sample areas with the full knowledge that she, traveling alone in the late 1940s, would be misinterpreted as a woman of questionable repute. She would immediately, upon entering the town, visit a minister of the local church, describe what she was doing there, a minister who would often offer free lodging and meals for her. But that step of legitimacy in the community was necessary to get the work done. That national field force was a fixed cost of social science research and surveys. Few organizations made that investment. Indeed, I really suspect that no university would have funded that investment by themselves, and I don't think no university now would fund such an investment. It permitted, however, ISR to be the choice of empirical social scientists, not just at Michigan, but throughout the world, a place to have their data collection done for their own project. And that allowed the amortization of the huge costs of building that infrastructure. In 1945-46, Lickert and the team's evangelism about empirical social science had another feature. Instead of remaining in DC, they chose, as you know, to locate in Ann Arbor, and that changed everything. ISR's 50th anniversary used the metaphor of a telescope on society. I like the metaphor. The metaphor has resonance for describing the first years of the Institute for Social Research. There were designers and fabricators of the lenses of the telescope. There were others that pointed the telescope in different directions to address different questions. There were those who decided on the key questions to be addressed and where to point the telescope. But there, next to them were people constantly refining the telescope's capacities. The metaphor has limits. ISR is now on a more global hunt for the causal mechanisms of human thought and behavior. This requires the telescope, now pointed at the entire species, but also microscopes, or more specifically, spectrophotometers, from cells to society, from DNA to global humanity. Much has changed since 1946 through 49. The sample survey has won over federal agencies, which now let contracts for national surveys with private sector entities, huge companies like Westat, Mathematica, AIR. As Bob Kahn predicted in that paragraph at the start of one of our chapters, some of the societal norms that supported Americans reporting intimate details to a stranger, those have decayed. The statistical theory underlying inference from sample survey results to important populations of interest is threatened by the failure to completely measure the chosen sample. The cost of measuring humans has risen to such an extent that the federal surveys are being dropped or being shrunken in their sample sizes. The costs are enormous. And so survey re-engineering has been a constant feature of the community over the last 75 years. And we've moved from face-to-face measurement to telephone measurement to web-based measurement to text surveys. Unfortunately, every cost-cutting move of data collection seems to yield lower and lower participation of a sample. My friends now in the private sector celebrate the achievement of a 7% response rate to their surveys. They are dancing in the hallways, which means that 93% of the inference is dependent on post-survey adjustment of one sort or another. As surveys decay, other methods of studying human thought and behavior are continuing to proceed, however, and many of us believe that the future is a blending of multiple data sets, each of which is fallible in its own way, into a coordinated system of records, the use of statistical models to draw inference, and the designation of all data on persons not as the property of a particular organization, but as a national resource which should be open for the analysis of questions relevant to the common good. This is already happening at ISR. In that sense, the mission of the empirical social sciences that Lickert articulated in the 1939 article would not change for ISR. It would be manifested in new ways. If we were drinking right now, I would raise a toast to those scholars who chose not just to work for their own individual prestige and glory and influence, but to build an institution that would outlast them and nurture the work of thousands of others, everyone in this room included. Their vision, the culture they built, their wisdom in seeing the value of independent research coordinated around multidisciplinary teams, this is what we celebrate, in my opinion, at this moment. Thank you. So Michael has given me permission to take a couple of questions, which usually means no one will raise their hand.
I think it's because your comments were so all-encompassing.
Thank you very much. See you.